Gone Home tells the story of a young woman named Katie having just returned home after a year backpacking through Europe. She finds a house abandoned, with remnants of the life of her family scattered about for us to uncover. The game puts us in her shoes, both literally and metaphorically, as we struggle to figure out where they are and what has happened in the interim. We share her ignorance and curiosity, and set about trying to put together the pieces of a life she now knows very little about. You find stories embedded in the environment itself, whether it be bills, letters, or books. But there is also a narrative through-line dispensed to you in the form of tape recordings by your younger sister. Intrigue turns to concern and then fear, as you waver between assuming the worst and hoping for the best. Amongst the many things you uncover is a sister finding her sexuality, a father dealing with his demons and his paranoia, and a mother frustrated and trapped by her marriage. This story is delivered by narration and through the environment, but there is no sign of traditional mechanics and fail states. This creative liberty with the foundation of games and an emphasis on narrative troubles many, who claim games like this aren't actually games. What we find is if we dismiss these experiences as not games, we might have to reevaluate what games are in their entirety. The term walking simulator is a derogatory moniker first used to describe Dear Esther, a game that stripped away all pretense of challenge and traditional mechanics and was concerned solely with its story. Some people loved the themes of memory loss and existential horror, but others claimed this wasn't a game in the classical sense, as it had no fail states or challenge. Instead, the mechanics are subordinate to the story and atmosphere, which pretty much entails uncovering areas that trigger narrative sequences to piece together what is going on. It's strange that people thought this to be some revelatory thing, because this structure has been with us much longer. The best-selling Myst games were effectively interactive novels with puzzle-solving elements, where you had to piece together what had happened in the world long ago. Stories where things happened in the past, but are not happening in the present, known as drama, has been embedded in the DNA of games for quite a while. Even the old text-based adventures like Zork and Colossal Cave Adventure are fundamentally about maneuvering through space and figuring out where to go and what it all means. Because rendering objects in action were not easy back then, developers instead situated the player in a world where things transpired in the past. It's not unique to games, with books and movies having implied backstories and flashbacks as well, but games allow you to piece together the past through actions in the present. Even the BioShock games effectively put the first act, the exposition-heavy initial arc of a story, in the form of audio logs that you uncover in the dramatic action now, allowing the mechanics to take center stage, but still preserving the storytelling conceit of Myst and walking simulators. Call of Duty, Battlefield, and pretty much most shooters and RPGs all have collectibles and audio logs scattered across the world to give the actions a history and context. Does this make games less gamey? The most mechanically intense games use the foundation of environmental storytelling in their narratives, like Dark Souls, because it is a potent way to fill in backstory and incidental details from a hard-to-convey Act 1, and this is embedded in the DNA of most of our games. But this is a digression, some might say. You have not addressed the core issue of challenge and fail states. This is actually very interesting if we think about it. If we had a game where we had to move through space from A to B without any obstacles, is that a game? Games are an inherently spatial medium, and most with any narrative ambitions are usually about getting from point A to B. If we accept this premise, there must be things on the path from A to B that prevent, inhibit, or require skill to overcome to constitute a game. This skill can be either dexterous, or it can be cognitive like a puzzle game. If we take the cognitive part, games like Portal are about getting from A to B, but engage our minds. Does it have a fail state? Sure, you can be zapped by a laser, but the fail state is hardly relevant here. Is this now no longer a game? On the dexterity side, games like Call of Duty require rapid reflexes and decision-making on our way to the end of the level, and death is a constant and inevitable occurrence. This is challenge in the traditional sense. With a walking sim like Gone Home, what's stopping you from finishing the game? You have to piece together what's happening enough to get to the attic, but there is no mechanical challenge there in the sense of needing to learn tactile instructions and skills. It really is fascinating to get into the minutiae like this, as what constitutes skill is also subjective. One man's obstacle is another man's cakewalk, not a Portal pun. You could say there is skill involved in traversing space, but that may be pushing it. Clearly, some kind of cognitive and physical skill is needed for some to consider these games, and not just that, they have to have a certain complexity. This gets us into deeper water, because games like Journey then come into question. It has no fail state, there is no real challenge barring some very simple platforming and light puzzles, yet no one is questioning it as a game, or maybe they are and I just haven't caught up. What I think is at the heart of this conflict is the age-old debate between gameplay and story. Walking simulators are first and foremost about their stories and only use mechanics to convey their core theme. Dear Esther is an interactive novel, Gone Home uses environmental storytelling. The Stanley Parable wants to question the nature of freedom and agency in games and requires minor interactivity to tell this. Again, there is no challenge there necessarily, but what it is doing is not giving us a challenge, but challenging us in different ways. These games are challenging us to think differently about what constitutes a game and what doesn't. It's challenging us about different themes like love, metaphysics, determinism, loyalty, and memory. Journey is a parable for the hero's journey in interactive form, and it uses mechanics to simulate joy, sadness, peril, and transcendence. The thing to understand, I think, is that just meandering through space tells its own story. Mind you, it's not a very good story, as most storytellers will tell you, the heart of a story is conflict. Walking simulators are presenting conflict differently than we traditionally have thought of, and for that they have gotten vilified. The conflict in Gone Home is piecing together what happened for yourself, and may not be fully resolved on your first playthrough. A game like Proteus is just a procedurally generated zen stroll through an alien soundscape, and the meaning there is emergent and embedded in sensory emotions. Edith Finch tries to get us to uncover what happened to a family mired in tragedy. The point is, the conflict is represented differently than in traditional games, but it can be challenging in different ways. Now obviously they have to have some semblance of interactivity to remain games in any sense, but you get the point. In his GDC talk entitled The Play of Stillness, Brian Upton argues that we as a medium get too caught up in the term interactivity when we think of games. He suggested the line between a game and a player is not as discrete as many think, and that much of what constitutes a game takes place in a player's head. For example, in a turn-based RPG, much of what is happening takes place between turns, when there is no interactivity in the classical sense. The same goes for strategy games, puzzle games, and games like chess. Where is the interactivity between two turns of a chess game? He calls this anticipatory play, and argues this is a powerful part of the gaming medium. Additionally, he defines something called interpretive play, which also takes place in the player's head, but is more about explaining and understanding a narrative. In a game like PT, you are literally walking through the same corridor, but the play comes from seeing discrepancies, noticing environmental cues, and trying to uncover what happened. Each player brings with them their history of psychological experiences, and this affects the interpretation of a play space. Once more, interactivity is minimal here, but there is still a game involving some form of play. Games like Limbo use this framework, but add puzzles on top of it to seem more gamey. However, that game has as many theories about what is happening as there are people playing it, so it leverages the power of interpretive play to tell its story. The point is, much of how we play and interact with games takes place in our heads, and walking simulators are at the forefront of exploring this space in innovative ways.
So I said previously, a game is an engine for generating interesting situations. But by the same token, a story is an engine for generating interesting situations. A symphony is an engine for generating interesting situations. A painting is an engine for generating interesting situations. There's a wide variety of different ways to produce these sorts of play. As game designers, we have a unique ability with the sort of tools we have, the interactive tools, the ways we can have things evolve procedurally to deliver these sorts of things. But it's similar in many ways to what is done with other forms of art.
The confusion may mostly have to do with how we are traditionally fed stories in games. We have the linear Uncharted model, where gameplay and cutscenes are like oil and water, with occasional instances of minor interactivity during cutscenes and supplementary narrative during gameplay. There is the Half-Life model, which does away with cutscenes entirely and embeds the story in the world itself, lessening the cinematic fidelity, but enhancing the immersive feel. And finally, we have games that tell stories purely through mechanics, like Missile Command and its parable about the horrors of nuclear war. The lines between these are not impermeable, with some games expertly leveraging all three effectively, but most games emphasize one over the other. The Uncharted model is really strange if you think about it, as it's kind of like playing a game of tennis, but after every point you have to stop and watch a short animated film before you can proceed. Or conversely, It's like reading a book, but then having to finish a puzzle every chapter's end. It seems utterly arbitrary and disconnected to many, but to be fair, the thematic context and urgency is preserved from cutscene to gameplay. What walking simulators are trying to do is destroy that division entirely, making a story that makes sense through the mechanics where the two harmonize around an authored narrative. They are not so much concerned with emergent stories like, say, Far Cry, but how to use interactivity to enhance the stories we can tell through our medium.
His mind began to wander. I asked him to describe it. He said he started small, imagining a labyrinth.
I'm trying to avoid spoilers for these games, but it's worth outlining some of the other design innovations walking simulators have brought to the fore. Journey has a section late in the game that allows you to fly with kinetic freedom, which is meant to emulate transcendence in the hero's journey. This is using movement as a metaphor. The Stanley Parable has a narrator that tells you what you will do, and if you subvert his demands, he will adapt to the decisions in ways that suggest he knew what you would do to begin with, making you question the very nature of free will. The game shows the power of dynamic narrative and supplementary commentary when traversing space, something used in games like Bastion. Speaking of dynamism, Proteus's musical environment shows how space can fuse with other sensations to make navigation a part of artistic creation itself. Moving from A to B can be art, something sound shapes also leveraged beautifully. Speaking of which, The Unfinished Swan, an often neglected game, has this fascinating opening where you use paint to highlight an environment concealed by pitch whiteness. This is an intriguing conceptual inversion of negative space, and a systemized expression of the idea that art is about subtraction, not addition. This is made more powerful because the story's themes are about incomplete artwork, an artist's legacy, and the transformative power of art. The Witness expands on this, using its puzzles in ways that force you to incorporate the environment to uncover its mysteries, making its walking pace a mechanical tool and to tell a story about obsession and abstraction itself. 30 Flights of Loving and Virginia are two games that use cuts and other filmic devices to play with our sense of time, given that we are trapped maneuvering through space. They leverage this for their themes to destabilize our sense of self and maximize their interpretive space. Edith Finch takes this to heart as well, expanding our sense of self by using a fascinating mix of styles and genres as vignettes in an overarching story to represent different members of a doomed family, and there are some brilliant uses of mechanical interaction to heighten these themes. Finally, Dr. Langeskov makes the player complicit in the recreation of an authored spatial experience for another player. The game plays with the idea of authorship, play, and audience in powerful ways, but I'll leave it at that for now. I really think we are just scratching the surface when it comes to understanding what we can convey with the simple act of navigating space. I will admit that many walking simulators have not perfected this, just as mechanical stories like Uncharted suffer from crippling dissonance. It will take time, but I'm sure a game that will resolve this divide will come very soon. Firewatch and Edith Finch add more mechanical things while still keeping it grounded in their fiction, and so developers will only improve with time. With the context of the narratives of most walking sims, there is even an objective, and it is a deliberate story that the authors want to convey that we have to work a little harder than just passively observing a screen to uncover. You see the issue with dismissing these as not games? A lot of their DNA is rooted in a lot of the genres we play, whether adventure games, puzzle games, shooters, or RPGs, and so to dismiss them is to question the very identity of what a game is. Even the great Ludwig Wittgenstein struggled with this. In his philosophical Tracticus, he argued we can't find a singular definition of a game, as any attempt to do so would reveal exceptions. If we say it is fun, we find unfun games. If we say two people, we have solitaire. If we say skill, then games of chance get omitted, and if we say it's safe, then injuries in football discounted. His solution to the problem was to define things in accordance with their family resemblances, or similarities. The cognitive scientist Douglas Hofstadter argues we define things analogously, so we never have a precise definition, just a nebulous spectrum. Walking simulators straddle the line between film, interactive media, and games, and it's up to a consensus what they get considered as. Hofstadter also argues that as new things pop up, they actually expand the original definition of something. For example, the word mother expanded to motherland, motherlode, and so mother really refers to essence, most important, inviolable, precious, home, and sovereignty. This was only clarified after there was semantic expansion. Similarly, with walking simulators challenging the status quo, we have to expand our definition of games to accommodate what a game is. Games can be narrative-based interactive experiences that challenge us on themes that are more nuanced than a power fantasy or a rags-to-riches adventure. The problem with gaming thus far is that it has been dominated by engineers and software geeks, not storytellers. Poor scripts in games but cutting-edge tech attest to this. Actually, a movie will not go into production unless there is a script, but games more often than not don't even have one. They have a design doc, with minor narrative details sure, but mostly the hardware and technology needed to realize a vision. As our medium matures and incorporates both storytellers and engineers, we were bound to get some conflict along the way. I dare to envision a future where we get past these growing pains and find a way to reconcile both gameplay and story in powerful ways. Walking simulators are an integral step on our way to this vision, and as such, we should welcome them with open arms into our medium. Thank you guys for watching. If you have any more ideas about this topic, please leave them in the comments below. And if you want more content like this, please be sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching guys, and I'll see you next time.